I was born and raised in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. My best friend, who I don't want to name, lived in a more upper-class area than I did with large lots that were surrounded by hills. His family had such a nice house with a huge yard that I loved spending time at, and I was out there all the time when we were kids. We went to school together from kindergarten all the way through high school, and I spent the night at his house more times than I can count. A couple of things about him, which seemed totally normal to me at the time, was that whenever I stayed the night, he would always have to wear this sleep mask over his eyes when we went to bed. His mom said it helped him sleep better, so I never questioned anything. It was just his thing. And then, on many different occasions, he would clearly talk in his sleep. This wasn't just a few random words, he would have actual conversations in his sleep. It was actually funny to hear back then, and if it went on for too long or it was keeping me up, I would nudge him or make a loud noise to make him stop. After years of this, it became a normal thing he did, and it was just part of staying the night there. It wasn't until we were in 8th grade that I got curious and actually started paying attention to what he was saying. That's when I realized how weird it was, and when I tell you this, you'll see what I mean. He would have these long, clear, and coherent conversations with a separate family that was not his parents, and I guess they were from an entirely different place outside of our solar system. He would ask about their long trips, which always sounded like it took them months to get to him. I would also hear him answering specific questions about school and about his actual parents and friends, and sometimes his answers would get oddly personal about his physical health, like more than I wanted to know about him if I'm being totally honest. It was almost like he was being quizzed or answering some kind of checklist, and this happened many separate times where he would give different answers each time as we got older. Over time, I got moderately obsessed with this alternate reality he seemed to be living in when he was asleep, and I pieced together a couple of things. First, he would talk to this other family often, and they would come to see him in person once or twice a year. When they did, it was a big deal. Second, it was always the same type of conversation where this other set of parents would check in with him. I never said a word about it because it felt weird to me back then and I didn't want him to be embarrassed. I also figured it was some kind of sleep disorder that they all knew about since his mom openly made him wear his sleep mask every night. By the time we were in high school, he seemed to grow out of it, or at least I didn't notice it anymore. And during our junior and senior years, I wasn't staying over there anymore because we were both older and busy with finishing school and girlfriends and everything else that comes with transitioning into adult life. After we graduated, I went to college in Maryland and only came back during holidays. We always kept in touch but didn't see each other in person for a few years. Then, when we were 22, I came back for a 2-week visit and ended up going out to his house again for dinner and to catch up since he was still living at home. His parents were always like family to me, and we spent most of the evening eating, drinking, and talking. Later that night, the two of us were down in his basement/rec room, which was where we used to sleep and hang out when we were kids. We were making drinks and laughing about old times and the shenanigans we used to get into, and it was really a fun night. Maybe it was the alcohol, but I finally brought up how he used to talk in his sleep, and I asked him if he ever knew he was doing it. This is something that I wish I had never done. The look on his face when I asked that question was so weird, and he immediately got nervous and defensive. He did answer me and told me he knew, but then he started aggressively prying into what I had heard him say and why I cared about it. I was totally honest with him because he was like a brother to me and basically gave him a condensed version of everything. This is a guy I've known my entire life, but as he sat there asking me all these questions, I felt like I didn't even know him. It was like an actual Jekyll and Hyde change in his personality, and it was incredibly uncomfortable. Right in the middle of this, he got up and just walked upstairs. I stayed on the couch and felt horrible about bringing it up. I didn't really know what to do, but I could hear him upstairs talking to his parents. I couldn't understand anything they were saying, but he was up there for a long time, probably 10 minutes. Then when he finally came back downstairs, he told me it was getting late and that he had to work in the morning. I have always been horrible with confrontation and uncomfortable situations, so I quietly took that as my cue to go home. I did apologize for bringing it up, which he really didn't respond to, and as I was grabbing my stuff upstairs and leaving, I thanked his parents for having me over and told them how nice it was to see them again, but all three of them were acting so weird with me after that. It was like they all suddenly didn't want me there anymore and they were rushing to get me out. When I left their house, I felt really upset about the whole night. I didn't even know what I did wrong, and I have never felt such negative energy toward me in my entire life. It was like they had some big family secret and I knew something about it, so they cast me out. I don't really know how to explain it. Unfortunately, our friendship was never the same after that. I've only seen him one single time since that happened, and it was at a mutual friend's house and completely on accident. I stayed in Maryland after college because I got a job here, but I still text him now and then to see how things are going. That's really the extent of our contact with each other though, just small talk via text message. We never talk on the phone anymore, and he's never once asked to get together when I go back home. I don't know what happened, but it bothers me a lot and I feel like I lost a family member. The reason I wanted to tell my story is because this has been on my mind nearly every day for several years. I don't know when this hit me exactly, but at some point I asked myself a very out-of-the-box question, and that question was, what if it was real? That thought had never even occurred to me, but once it did, I couldn't stop thinking about it. What if he really was communicating with other beings? What if he actually did have a separate family from somewhere beyond what we know or understand? What if his actual parents know about it, or even crazier, are part of it? And if any of those are true, what does that make him? I don't know the answer to any of those questions. Maybe someday I'll find the courage to just show up at his door and bluntly ask what happened and figure out what he's not telling me, but being the way I am, I can't ever see myself doing that. For now, I'll just keep checking in with him when I can and hope that he'll decide to make the first move someday. I really hope he does, because I miss my friend, no matter who he is. What follows concerns an experience I had in 2018. Although the experience could simply have been a very vivid dream, I have come not to see it in that way. One important note at the outset is that the way I experienced this story was not chronological in my memory. The latter part occurred first. I will clarify this at the end to make it easier to follow. I am recounting the events as I think they must have occurred. This was during a difficult period in my life. I was 28 years old but had needed to move back home to save money. I was in an unfulfilling relationship that I was not happy with, working an underpaid and unappreciated job in the education field. My home is in a relatively rural small neighborhood in Connecticut. There was a buildup of strange events that peaked with a direct encounter with a group of beings that I've come to call the Others. It all started with a strange bout of insomnia. For almost a week leading up to it, I couldn't sleep. I would find myself feeling exhausted by 10 and falling deeply asleep for a few hours, but then invariably waking up, always around 1:30 to 2 o'clock in the morning. This continued for 4 or 5 nights. Each successive night I would wake up increasingly anxious and alarmed for no clear reason. Objectively, I knew I was safe. I was sleeping in my childhood bedroom in my very safe childhood home and in my exceptionally safe town where literally nothing bad ever happens. Yet each night that passed, I would find myself waking out of a deep, dreamless sleep into near terror with no apparent object of my dread. On the 4th night I woke up as I tossed and turned in bed. I was trying to comfort myself by listening to the sounds outside my open window. It was early summer and I preferred to keep my window wide open rather than use the AC. There is a little pond across the street as well as thin bands of woodland separating our property from the neighbors, and at night we can hear peeping frogs and crickets outside, which is normally quite relaxing. That night, however, I became aware that it was dead silent, almost like the middle of winter, which was not normal. Then just a few moments later, I started to hear the distinct sound of footsteps outside. The woods around my house are small, and the largest animals that inhabit them would be coyotes or the occasional deer, which usually make little to no sound at all. These footsteps were heavy and deliberate, and from their steady cadence, I could tell that whatever was making them was obviously bipedal. The sound of dead leaves rattling and small twigs snapping seemed almost deafening in the general silence, and whatever was making the heavy footfalls did not seem at all concerned about being overheard. I could follow them as they crossed from the woods into our backyard, and I listened to them grow louder and closer until at last they seemed to stop outside immediately underneath my second-floor window. For some reason, my heart was absolutely pounding in irrational terror at that point, and I was fearful of letting whatever was creating the footfalls know I was aware of its presence. Don't get me wrong, it was weird, and the idea of some prowler standing outside would make anyone anxious, but once again, my level of fear seemed illogical given the circumstance, yet I couldn't get myself to calm down. I laid still in bed, heart pounding, and controlling my breath for maybe 2 or 3 minutes. I considered trying to look outside, but at that time of night, our yard is pitch black and I knew it was unlikely I'd be able to see anything clearly. I focused on staying silent, and after a few moments, the footsteps continued across my yard, into the woods on the other side of my house and out of range. As soon as they became inaudible, I heard the sounds of peepers and crickets return outside, but not all at once. It was more like the volume on a television being gradually turned back up. The next night was even stranger. Once again, I woke up around 1:30 or 2 a.m. to the sound of footsteps, but this time it sounded like they were inside my house, downstairs. Not only that, but it also sounded like I was hearing multiple pairs of footsteps, and one set seemed to be climbing our stairs. I have always been terrified of the prospect of a home invasion, so I leapt to my feet, grabbed a large pocket knife from my drawer, and ran to the stairs. The sound of footsteps was so clear, I was fully expecting to confront an intruder. Yet as I peered down the stairs, then cautiously crept down the steps, it became clear that no one was actually there. I quietly checked out the first floor where my parents were sleeping and even peered down into our basement, but there was nothing. At this point, I felt both frightened and like a paranoid idiot, so I returned to my bed and attempted to go back to sleep. And once again, like a television being turned up, I started to hear the footsteps again. This time, however, they seemed to be outside my house and on the roof, which was impossible. There is no access to our roof from inside or outside without a ladder. It felt as though the footsteps were mocking me. Even more strangely, in spite of these events, a few moments later I ended up falling into a deep sleep. At this point, I should pause to say that these 2 nights' events have no obvious direct connection with the events that followed, but given they all happened in quick succession, I can't help but feel they're related somehow. The third night is one I will never forget. I awoke to a sound unlike any I have ever heard before or since. It was a deep, oscillating hum. It was a thrumming sound that was so deep and powerful I could feel it in my head and chest, and it sounded like it was directly over my house. I lived in this house for over 20 years, and I know the sound of every air conditioner, generator, power tool, or motor that our neighbors have, and I can say with certainty that this sound was not caused by any of those things. The sound filled me with the most intense, overwhelming terror I have ever experienced. My heart was pounding and I was literally shaking with fear. In my head, all I kept thinking was, they know I'm awake. I'm not supposed to hear them. I'm not supposed to be awake, and they know when we perceive them. I kept repeating these few sentences in my head like a mantra. I buried my head under my pillow and wrapped myself completely in the covers like a child, wishing more than anything to be asleep. That's when I remember suddenly finding myself in a cylindrical room, sitting back like I was in a dentist chair. I have no memory of how I got from my bedroom to this other room, and I even recall at one point thinking I was literally in 2 places at once. The light in this other room was dim, but I could make out a total of 6 figures surrounding me. 5 of the figures were tall with large black eyes and the stereotypical appearance of so-called grays, except they were a pale bluish color rather than the traditional gray. As strange as it sounds, I remember thinking they were oddly beautiful. The other figure in the room, funnily enough, was a stooped, wrinkled, and remarkably old man with a bald head, a large, very long white mustache, and a beard. In contrast to just a moment before, I now felt completely relaxed, even euphoric. I was dimly aware that the old man and the others were communicating about me and that something was wrong. I remember consenting to them helping me in some way, though again, I can't remember what was actually said. I then recall the elderly man helping me tip my head back as one of the others produced a long, thick, silver needle-like object, though the end of it did not appear to be sharp. As I tilted my head back, the others proceeded to insert the needle into my right nostril, and I could feel it stretch the bottom of the nostril as it proceeded up into my nasal cavity, and then it felt like it went all the way into my brain. I remember so clearly that while this felt weird, the only pain I experienced was actually at the bottom of my nostril near the opening, which was uncomfortably stretched by the angle of the needle. I know this experience sounds nightmarish, but remember, it honestly felt as though I had consented to it, and for some reason I felt then and still feel as though whatever they were doing was sincerely for my own good. My last image was of the old man's face peering down at me, looking wrinkled and ancient but kind, and with startling blue eyes. Then there was a loud click that I seemed to feel in my head more than hear. My next memory is waking up the next morning. What is strangest about all these experiences is that while I remember each episode clearly, my recollection of them seems out of order. I know the loud thrumming noise lasted approximately 5 minutes, and I heard it change locations a few times before it simply vanished. It seemed to change location from over my house to my neighbor's house, back to my house, and then it was gone. In my memory, the noise and the sheer terror I felt came after my memory of being in the room with the beings, even though logically it should have happened prior. That bizarre sense of being in two places at once, and of being both horrified and deeply relaxed at the same time, was unlike anything else I've ever felt. A few weird occurrences happened in the days after this experience. The very next day, while I was in the bathroom, my nose suddenly started bleeding profusely from my right nostril. I almost never get nosebleeds, but this was a lot of blood and it was dark. It only lasted a few minutes, but it was unprecedented. It's still the only heavy nosebleed I've ever had. I also experienced headaches and general body aches in the days that followed. Emotionally, I was very off for a few weeks. My friends and family noticed it and kept asking if I was all right. In contrast to my usual extroversion, I became very quiet and withdrawn, and my parents and friends were worried about me to the point that I spent a lot of the next few weeks seeking time alone. It's sad to say, but I knew that few of my friends or family would genuinely listen to me about this experience. I was worried that people would think I was psychotic. Finally, after a few days, I felt like I had to talk to somebody about it, so I chose to disclose it to my best friend, who does have a lot of interest in aliens, conspiracies, and the paranormal. He was supportive, and talking to him really helped me come to terms with everything that happened. That same night after disclosing it, we happened to be eating Chinese food. I opened a fortune cookie and the fortune read, "Take some time for yourself tonight, look up at the sky and relax." It could have just been a coincidence, but I remember when I read that, it literally gave me chills. It made me feel like these beings, the others, are so incredibly beyond us in technology and foresight that they strike me less like sci-fi aliens and more like angels or gods. Overall, I'm grateful I had this experience, even though parts of it were unbelievably terrifying. I still can safely say I have never felt fear like what I felt that night in my bed when the loud thrumming sound was right outside my window. However, I also cannot forget the sense of ease and even relief I felt when I was in the examination chair, in spite of how terrible the experience might sound. I think my sense of awe and wonder at the reality of the others was far outweighed by my momentary discomfort with whatever they were doing, and I still feel that way now. Most of all, my life has improved dramatically since that time, and I sometimes wonder if whatever clicked in me that night had something to do with it. I am a very different person from who I was 7 years ago. I'm married, I have a stable job which I love, and I'm far healthier and more confident than I was back then. I often wonder if all these positive changes in my attitude, personality, and outlook, which led me to the wonderful life I have today, could ever have occurred without this strange event taking place. Overall, in spite of their godlike powers and technology, I think the others have one very important similarity with humans. They are neither wholly good nor wholly bad, they just are what they are. I don't think of them as sci-fi villains or invaders, but I do think we should regard them with respectful fear and awe. When I was 12 years old, my neighborhood friends and I used to sleep out on my friend's trampoline on warm summer nights. We would gather our bedding and bounce around until we got tired, then eventually lay down and just go to sleep. We all lived out in the country in Granville, Ohio, so the night sky was always amazing to look at while we talked and dozed off. We had campouts like this during summer break for years. One particular evening, it was my two best friends and me, Josh and Ryan. Ryan was Josh's cousin, and another friend of ours, Tyler. After riding bikes all day and jumping on the trampoline until we were exhausted, we grabbed our blankets and pillows and laid there talking until we noticed something strange above the tree line in the woods next to his house. We couldn't see anything directly, and I don't even know how to describe what we saw. Something was sort of blocking out the stars, but not completely, and it was moving. I almost want to say it looked like heat because it seemed to be warping the light behind and around it more than it was actually blocking it. It was just barely higher than the tops of the trees, but definitely noticeable, and all four of us could see it clearly. We were dumb kids back then, so we just sat there and watched it, not even thinking of getting his parents. One of us even said that it looked like the cloak or camouflage from the movie Predator. We all agreed too, it really did look like that, except it was a single large shape. We watched it slowly float past the trees and closer to us until it was directly over the trampoline. I can still picture looking straight up at it like it happened yesterday because we all had a perfectly clear close-up view of this thing, which was still distorting the stars behind it. You would think, being young boys, we would be yelling, jumping, and freaking out, but for some reason, none of us did that. We were all perfectly calm and just staring at it. I have no other memory of anything else happening after it was above us on the trampoline. Then, in what felt like a literal blink, we were back inside the house and standing next to each other at his sliding glass back door. I remember all of us looking at each other without even saying a word. Then, beyond all logic or reason, we just walked back out to the trampoline and went to sleep. For reasons I will never understand, none of us questioned what we had seen or what happened to us, and not a word was spoken about it until many years later. Josh moved to Florida that fall because of some family thing, and we lost touch. Since he didn't live there anymore, his cousin Ryan stopped coming around after a while too, and I was never that close with Tyler, so that was kind of the end of it for several years. Then when I was 18, I heard that Josh was back in town and staying with family. I ended up running into him at a party one night, and we talked for a while about Florida and him wanting to move back to Ohio. It was nice to see him and hang out again, but before I was going to leave to go to my girlfriend's house, I pulled him aside. I had to ask him about the trampoline incident because even though we had never talked about it, it was this nagging thing that bothered me for a long time. It's hard for me to even describe his reaction because it was so unexpected and not like him. When I asked him if he remembered seeing the thing above us on the trampoline and if he had any idea of how we ended up back inside Tyler's house, he looked at me like I had 3 heads and said, "You don't remember?" I told him I remembered seeing it above us, then suddenly being back in the house with no memory of actually getting off the trampoline and going inside. He asked me again, "You really don't remember?" I think he could tell from the look on my face that I genuinely had no idea what he was talking about. Then he looked down at the floor and said he didn't want to talk about it anymore. It was such a weird interaction that I didn't know what to say, and there was this long, awkward pause. Then he just turned around and walked out of the house without even looking at me and left the party. It actually made me kind of mad because it was rude. After standing there for a second, I went outside to find him, but he was just driving away when I got outside. I left him a long message on his phone and told him to call me, but I never saw or spoke to Josh, Ryan, or Tyler ever again. It wasn't until a week or 2 after that party that it really started to eat at me because I still don't know what he meant. The way he reacted when I said I didn't remember anything was weird and honestly a little creepy. Was I supposed to remember something? It still bugs me that Josh cut me off like he did, but I've mostly put it behind me now. I really believe that the 4 of us experienced a true case of lost time. I know I did because I don't remember a damn thing, but apparently Josh remembers something, and whatever it is, he definitely doesn't want to talk about it. The more I picture Josh's reaction and facial expression when we were talking, the more I realize that whatever it was, I don't want to remember.